The moment someone tells you your family history can be erased with a single sheet of paper, you learn exactly how much the truth is worth. The sound that pulled me out of bed that morning was not thunder, not a passing truck, and not the familiar rumble of my own tractor warming up before sunrise. It was the deep, steady growl of a bulldozer idling just beyond my front porch. I threw on my boots, stepped outside into the cool Texas morning, and stopped cold at the edge of my porch. A bright yellow bulldozer sat less than 60 feet from my grandfather's old red barn, its steel blade resting quietly against the gravel while fresh orange survey stakes stretched across the pasture in a perfectly straight line. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with damp grass and cedar drifted through the crisp morning air as the first rays of sunlight spilled over the tops of the ancient oak trees surrounding my ranch. 3 contractors stood beside the machine holding clipboards and insulated coffee mugs, avoiding eye contact as though they wished they were somewhere else entirely. One of them offered an apologetic nod before quietly explaining they were waiting for final authorization before beginning any work. My eyes followed the line of orange stakes until they stopped at the eastern corner of the barn that had stood in exactly the same place for longer than I had been alive. Then I noticed the white sport utility vehicle parked neatly beside my gravel driveway. Rebecca Collins stepped out carrying a thick leather folder beneath one arm. Her navy blazer looked perfectly pressed despite the early hour, and she walked toward me with the confidence of someone delivering news she believed could no longer be questioned. She introduced herself only once when the subdivision behind my ranch had first been built, but I had seen her often enough at county meetings to recognize the president of the Homeowners Association immediately. Without raising her voice, she handed me a certified notice explaining that my barn allegedly violated the association's recorded property boundary. According to the enclosed documents, a recently commissioned land survey concluded that part of the structure extended onto property controlled by the association. The notice demanded payment of a $48,000 fine and warned that additional penalties would continue accumulating until the violation had been corrected. I slowly folded the papers without saying a single word. My name is Caleb Morgan. I am 43 years old, and every board, nail, and weathered beam inside that barn had belonged to my family long before anyone imagined building a subdivision beside this ranch. My grandfather raised the frame with neighbors who arrived carrying hammers instead of contracts. My father repaired the roof after every major storm. I spent my childhood feeding cattle, stacking hay, and learning responsibility inside those familiar walls. Rebecca continued explaining deadlines, compliance procedures, and possible legal action, but her words gradually disappeared beneath the quiet hum of the idling bulldozer. Something else had captured my attention. Near the eastern edge of the barn, almost hidden beneath years of dry grass and packed soil, a rusted piece of iron barely reflected the morning sunlight. Most people would never have noticed it. My father always did. He used to tell me that land never forgot where the truth began, even after people convinced themselves they had measured it differently. Standing there between my family's barn and the machine waiting to destroy part of it, I could not explain why that forgotten piece of iron suddenly felt more important than every official document resting inside Rebecca's folder. My grandfather, Walter Morgan, believed that every piece of land carried a memory if someone cared enough to notice it. He never measured the value of our ranch by its acreage or market price. He measured it by the mornings spent repairing fences with family, the evenings listening to cattle settle beneath the oak trees, and the generations who left their fingerprints on every weathered board inside the old red barn. That barn stood long before paved streets reached our corner of the county. It stood before decorative stone entrances, manicured lawns, and neighborhood streetlights appeared beyond our eastern pasture. To most people, it looked like an aging agricultural building with faded red paint and a roof that had survived more storms than anyone could count. To me, it was where my life had truly begun. I learned to swing a hammer inside those walls before I was tall enough to reach the workbench without standing on an overturned bucket. Every summer smelled of fresh hay, cedar lumber, machine oil, and warm dust floating through sunlight pouring between old wooden beams. Every winter the north wind found tiny gaps in the siding, creating the same familiar whistle that had echoed through the barn for decades. My father always smiled whenever he heard that sound because he said an old barn should remind you it was still alive. He rarely spoke about money or success. Instead, He taught me patience, responsibility, and respect for the land itself. Every Saturday morning we walked the ranch together, checking fences, clearing fallen branches, and inspecting drainage after heavy rain. Whenever we reached the eastern boundary, he slowed his pace and pointed toward patches of grass where old survey monuments rested quietly beneath the soil. He never allowed tractors to disturb those locations, even though they looked like nothing more than forgotten pieces of rusted iron. He always repeated the same lesson. Maps can be updated. Paperwork can be rewritten. Opinions can change. The land remembers where the first honest measurement was made. At the time, I thought he simply admired surveyors because they worked outdoors. Years later, I realized he understood something far more important. Accurate boundaries protected families long after the people who established them were gone. After college, I spent nearly 16 years working as a civil engineer across Texas, helping build roads, bridges, and drainage systems. Every project reinforced the same principle I had learned beside my father. Reliable decisions begin with reliable measurements. Eventually, I returned home when my father's health declined, taking over the ranch without hesitation because it never felt like leaving one career for another. It felt like coming home. I repaired the barn roof after spring storms, reinforced aging support beams, replaced broken fence posts, maintained the gravel driveway, and cared for the property exactly as my father and grandfather had before me. Nothing about the ranch had moved. The oak trees cast the same afternoon shadows. The barn stood exactly where generations of photographs showed it standing. The eastern pasture stretched toward the subdivision just as it always had. That was why the documents resting inside Rebecca Collins's folder felt impossible to accept. Every printed line on that polished survey contradicted decades of history I had lived with my own eyes. As I stood beside the barn watching sunlight spread across the pasture, my father's quiet voice returned to me once again. If the paper disagreed with the land, then somewhere, someone had begun measuring from the wrong place. Rebecca Collins believed that every problem could be solved with another meeting, another policy, or another document stamped with official approval. She never raised her voice because she never believed she needed to. As president of the Homeowners Association, she carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to having every recommendation accepted without much resistance. When the subdivision first expanded toward the eastern edge of my ranch several years earlier, I welcomed the new neighbors without hesitation. Families deserved peaceful places to live, just as my family deserved to continue caring for land we had owned for generations. My first conversation with Rebecca had been surprisingly pleasant. She arrived with a welcome basket, complimented the view across the pasture, admired the old oak trees, and mentioned that homeowners appreciated attractive neighboring properties because they helped preserve property values. I thanked her for stopping by and assumed that would be the end of our relationship. Looking back, I realized she spent far more time studying my barn than enjoying the scenery surrounding it. A few weeks later, the first certified letter appeared in my mailbox. It politely suggested that repainting the weathered red barn would improve the neighborhood's appearance from nearby homes. I respectfully declined, explaining that preserving the original exterior mattered to my family because the building represented decades of history. Soon afterward, another letter recommended replacing sections of my traditional ranch fencing with materials that better matched community standards. I answered with copies of county agricultural exemptions confirming that my fencing fully complied with every applicable regulation. Then another notice questioned farm equipment parked beside the barn. Another raised concerns about storage practices. Another suggested landscaping changes along the eastern pasture. Individually, none of the requests seemed especially significant. Together, they formed a pattern that slowly pushed farther beyond the association's authority. I responded calmly every time, providing photographs, permits, county records, and supporting documents without raising my voice or accusing anyone of acting unfairly. For several months, the letters stopped arriving, and I believed common sense had finally settled the matter. Then a formal invitation requested my attendance at the next Homeowners Association board meeting. The modern clubhouse smelled of fresh coffee and polished wood as board members quietly arranged binders across a long conference table beneath bright natural light streaming through tall windows. Rebecca welcomed everyone before projecting a detailed aerial map onto a large screen at the front of the room. My ranch appeared beside the subdivision, but something immediately felt wrong. A bold red property line crossed directly through the eastern side of my pasture before cutting across one corner of my grandfather's barn. Rebecca explained that the association had commissioned an updated professional survey establishing the current property boundary. Several board members nodded confidently while turning pages that had obviously been prepared before I ever entered the room. I politely asked whether anyone had compared the new measurements with the original county plats and historical legal descriptions recorded before the subdivision existed. Rebecca smiled courteously and replied that the updated survey represented the most accurate modern interpretation of the boundary. Around the room, nearly every head nodded in agreement. As I looked from the colorful presentation back toward the faces surrounding the table, I realized something unsettling. Every person in that room trusted the freshly printed lines on a projector screen more than the ground that had quietly remained unchanged for generations. The pressure did not arrive all at once after the board meeting. It settled over my ranch a little more each day until every ordinary morning carried a quiet feeling that someone else believed they already owned part of my family's history. 2 days after the meeting, I walked outside before sunrise carrying a bucket of feed and immediately noticed fresh orange paint sprayed across the grass near the eastern side of the barn. Thin wooden stakes connected by bright fluorescent strings stretched across the pasture in a perfectly straight line, dividing the landscape as though the dispute had already been decided. The sharp smell of marking paint mixed with damp earth while the rising sun reflected across the weathered metal roof above me. I stood silently for several minutes, studying the line that now crossed ground my grandfather had walked countless times. Before noon, another pickup truck slowly rolled into my driveway. 3 contractors stepped out carrying measuring wheels, clipboards, and rolled construction drawings. Their expressions were professional but uncomfortable. One of them explained they had only been hired to prepare a demolition estimate in case the homeowners association received legal authorization to require structural changes. He quietly admitted that no final order had been issued, but they wanted accurate numbers ready if enforcement continued. Hearing those words made everything feel far more real than another certified letter ever could. Complete strangers were calculating the cost of removing part of a barn my family had built decades before the subdivision even existed. During the following week, another notice appeared on the community website describing an ongoing compliance matter involving an agricultural structure located near the eastern boundary of Willow Creek Estates. My address never appeared, yet. Everyone living nearby understood exactly which property the announcement described. At the local feed store, conversations became noticeably quieter whenever I entered. One neighbor suggested I should simply settle because fighting a homeowners association often became more expensive than giving in. Another quietly told me that modern surveys usually carried more weight than older records. Nobody spoke with bad intentions, but every opinion added another layer of pressure. I visited the county records office hoping someone could immediately identify an obvious mistake. The clerk welcomed me with patience and helped retrieve archived plats, historical deeds, tax records, and subdivision filings. After reviewing everything available, she explained that the newer survey appeared properly filed and professionally certified. Unless another licensed survey established a measurable error, the county had no immediate reason to question it. I thanked her for her time, gathered copies of every historical document I could legally obtain, and returned to the ranch carrying more questions than answers. Every afternoon, another certified envelope seemed to appear inside my mailbox repeating payment deadlines, additional penalties, and possible legal consequences if compliance was delayed. I pinned every notice above the old wooden workbench inside the barn beside faded family photographs and my father's worn leather gloves. The bright white paper looked strangely temporary against timber that had survived generations of storms without complaint. That evening, I slowly walked the eastern fence line exactly as my father had done countless times before me. Warm Texas air carried the sound of distant cicadas while tall grass brushed softly against my boots. Near an overgrown corner where nobody had disturbed the ground for years, I stopped beside the place my father always seemed to notice without explanation. Looking down at the uneven earth, I remembered his quiet promise that the land never forgot where the first honest measurement had been made, and for the first time I began to wonder whether the answer had been waiting beneath the grass all along. By the beginning of the second week, I finally accepted something I had been trying to ignore. Determination alone would never defeat a professionally certified survey. If I wanted to protect my family's ranch, I needed evidence that carried the same legal weight as the documents Rebecca Collins continued mailing to my home. The next morning, I drove into town and met with a respected real estate attorney whose office overlooked the county courthouse. The room smelled of polished oak shelves, old legal books, and fresh coffee while sunlight filtered through tall windows onto a conference table covered with maps and property files. I carefully spread everything I had collected across the table. Original deeds passed down through my family, historical county plats, tax records, photographs of the barn taken across several decades, every certified notice from the Homeowners Association. The attorney reviewed each document without rushing, occasionally comparing legal descriptions with the recently filed survey commissioned by the association. After nearly an hour, he quietly removed his reading glasses and explained that my historical records appeared remarkably consistent, but the association's survey had also been prepared by a licensed professional. Personal memories and family photographs would never be enough. If we intended to challenge the boundary successfully, we needed physical evidence connected directly to the original legal survey itself. He explained that original county survey monuments carried extraordinary importance because every lawful property description ultimately depended upon those original reference points. I thanked him, gathered my documents, and drove back toward the ranch with a clearer direction than I had possessed since the dispute began. Warm afternoon sunlight stretched across the highway while dry grass swayed gently beside the road. For the first time, I realized I was no longer searching for someone to prove I was right. I was searching for the place where the first honest measurement had been made. Another certified envelope waited inside my mailbox when I returned home, repeating familiar payment deadlines and warning that additional penalties would continue accumulating. I pinned it beside the others above the old workbench inside the barn, where bright white paper looked strangely temporary against weathered boards that had survived generations of storms. As evening settled across the pasture, I walked once again toward the eastern boundary where my father had always slowed his steps. Kneeling carefully beside the overgrown patch of grass, I brushed away loose soil with my hands until my fingers touched something solid beneath the surface. A rusted iron cap slowly emerged from decades of packed earth. Most of its markings had faded beneath corrosion, yet several stamped letters remained visible enough to suggest official survey identification. I carefully photographed the monument from every possible angle before comparing its location with the association's survey map spread across the hood of my truck. The printed boundary refused to align with the monument resting in the ground. My pulse remained steady because I remembered exactly what my father had taught me all those years earlier. Survey monuments did not move simply because new maps were printed. Standing beneath the fading Texas sky, I reached into my pocket, called Daniel Brooks, one of the most respected licensed land surveyors in the county, and described exactly what I had found. He listened quietly before asking only one question. Had anyone disturbed the monument? When I answered that it remained untouched exactly where it had rested for decades, he paused briefly before replying with calm confidence. Leave everything exactly where it is. I will be at your ranch at sunrise tomorrow morning. Daniel Brooks arrived just after sunrise in an older white pickup truck loaded with the kind of equipment I had spent years working beside during my career as a civil engineer. Aluminum tripods, satellite receivers, measuring poles, weatherproof instrument cases, and neatly organized field notebooks filled the truck bed with practical purpose instead of unnecessary display. He stepped out, shook my hand, and walked directly toward the rusted survey monument without asking another question. The cool morning air carried the scent of damp grass, while soft, golden sunlight slowly spread across the faded red walls of the barn. Daniel knelt beside the iron cap, carefully brushed away another thin layer of dirt with a soft nylon brush, and studied the worn markings through a magnifying lens. For several quiet minutes, the only sounds came from distant cattle, singing meadowlarks, and the occasional electronic tone from his survey receiver as satellites established their connection high above the ranch. Finally, he stood and looked toward me with the calm confidence that comes from experience rather than assumption. He explained that the monument appeared to be an original county survey marker installed decades before the subdivision had ever been planned. That discovery alone did not automatically settle the dispute, but it established the proper reference point from which every legal boundary should be measured. We spent the rest of the morning moving carefully across the pasture. Daniel established control points, verified distances from multiple directions, and repeated every measurement until each result matched precisely. Nothing was rushed. Every coordinate was documented twice before becoming part of his official field notes. After lunch, we compared those measurements with historical county plats, original property deeds, engineering benchmarks, archived aerial photographs, and tax parcel records that I had gathered over the previous week. One transparent overlay after another settled across the tailgate of my pickup truck until a remarkably consistent pattern emerged. The original survey monument agreed with every historical document. The fence line built by my grandfather matched the legal description recorded decades earlier. The old drainage ditch followed the exact boundary shown on county maps long before the subdivision existed. Even the barn occupied the identical position in every aerial photograph preserved by the county archives. Only the newer survey commissioned by the Homeowners Association failed to align with the original evidence. Daniel carefully explained what he believed had happened. The newer survey appeared to establish its measurements from a more recent subdivision control point instead of the original county monument. That single mistake shifted every subsequent calculation several feet away from the lawful boundary. The measurements themselves appeared internally accurate, but the entire survey had been built upon the wrong starting location. It was the surveying equivalent of drawing a perfectly straight line after beginning from the wrong landmark. Late that afternoon, Daniel completed one final verification before closing his field notebook. He rested one hand gently on the weathered iron monument and quietly remarked that this small marker had preserved the same truth for decades while everyone else argued above it. Hearing those words lifted a burden I had carried since Rebecca Collins first handed me the certified notice beside the barn. For the first time, I no longer felt like a ranch owner trying to defend family memories against polished paperwork. I now possessed measurable evidence supported by licensed surveying methods, historical records, and the original monument itself. As warm Texas sunlight settled across the pasture, I realized the land had never changed its story. We had finally measured it from the place where the truth had always begun. Daniel Brooks did not celebrate after completing the survey. Instead, he returned to the tailgate of his pickup truck, opened his weathered field notebook, and began organizing every measurement with the same quiet discipline he had shown since arriving at my ranch. Watching him work reminded me that this case would never be won by louder arguments or stronger emotions. It would be decided by facts that could withstand careful examination from anyone willing to measure them honestly. During the following several days, my old barn slowly transformed into a temporary survey office. Large aerial photographs covered the wooden workbench where my father once repaired engines. Original county plats rested beside transparent overlays. Historical deeds, engineering benchmarks, tax parcel records, satellite measurements, and Daniel's handwritten field notes filled every available surface. The familiar scent of aged timber mixed with fresh printer ink and black coffee as we worked from sunrise until well after sunset without wasting a single hour. Daniel repeated every critical measurement before preparing his final report. He confirmed each property corner from multiple control points, verified the original survey monument against historical county records, documented every observation with photographs, and carefully explained every calculation inside a professionally organized report. Nothing depended upon assumptions. Every conclusion could be traced directly back to measurable evidence preserved on the land itself. 2 days later, my attorney returned carrying several empty binders. Together, we assembled the entire case exactly as the evidence naturally unfolded. The original family deed came first. Historical county plats followed. Archived aerial photographs demonstrated that the barn had occupied the identical location through every decade preserved by county records. Tax documents matched the legal description. Daniel's licensed survey connected every modern measurement back to the original county monument. Finally, we placed the Homeowners Association survey beside Daniel's completed report, allowing the difference between the two surveys to become immediately obvious without dramatic explanation. My attorney slowly closed the final binder and smiled for the first time since accepting my case. He explained that we were no longer asking anyone to trust family memories or personal opinions. We were presenting independent evidence created across several generations by surveyors, county officials, engineers, photographers, and public records that all pointed toward exactly the same boundary. That afternoon, he formally submitted our request for a county hearing together with every supporting exhibit. The hearing date arrived sooner than I expected. Meanwhile, Rebecca Collins continued acting with complete confidence. Another certified letter arrived repeating familiar demands and reminding me that additional financial penalties would continue until compliance had been achieved. During a homeowners association board meeting, Rebecca assured homeowners that the professionally prepared survey fully supported the board's position and that the matter would soon be resolved. I never responded publicly. There was no reason to argue anymore. Every evening, I walked through the quiet barn before locking the heavy iron latch, listening to its familiar metallic click echo softly across the weathered wooden walls. Outside, the bulldozer still waited beyond the pasture exactly where it had first appeared. The bright orange survey stakes remained planted across the grass, but they no longer unsettled me. Confidence built upon assumptions can appear convincing for a while. Confidence built upon verified evidence does not need to raise its voice. The land had already revealed the truth. All that remained was placing that truth before people willing to begin measuring from the place where it had always started. HOA, the county hearing began on a quiet Tuesday morning beneath clear Texas skies as warm sunlight streamed through the tall windows of the administrative building. The hallway carried the familiar scent of polished wood, fresh coffee, and aging paper while attorneys, surveyors, property owners, and county staff quietly waited for their cases to be called. Rebecca Collins arrived carrying a thick leather binder filled with carefully organized documents. Several homeowners association board members followed closely behind her, speaking with the calm confidence of people who believed the outcome had already been decided. Their attorney arranged enlarged survey maps across the conference table while a digital presentation displayed crisp boundary lines, setback measurements, certification stamps, and professional diagrams. Everything appeared organized, polished, and convincing. Sitting beside my attorney, I reminded myself that polished presentations had almost cost my family its barn once already. Daniel Brooks entered carrying only a weathered field case and 3 neatly labeled binders. He greeted the hearing officer respectfully before placing historical county plats, original property deeds, aerial photographs, engineering benchmarks, certified field notes, satellite measurements, and detailed photographs of the original county survey monument across the evidence table. Nothing about his presentation felt dramatic because it did not need to. He spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who trusted measurements more than assumptions. The Homeowners Association presented its case first. Rebecca explained that the board had acted responsibly to protect community property by relying upon a professionally prepared survey completed by licensed professionals. Their survey consultant carefully described modern equipment, current mapping techniques, and the conclusion that a portion of my family's barn extended beyond the lawful property boundary. When their presentation concluded, the hearing officer invited Daniel to respond. Daniel stood, opened the first binder, and began exactly where every legitimate property boundary should begin. He introduced the original county survey monument established decades before the subdivision existed, followed by the legal descriptions recorded within the earliest county deeds. One document connected naturally to the next. Historical plats matched original deeds. Archived aerial photographs showed the barn standing in exactly the same location across every available decade. Engineering benchmarks aligned perfectly with the original monument. Modern satellite measurements confirmed those historical boundaries with remarkable consistency. Finally, Daniel placed the Homeowners Association survey beside his completed report. The difference immediately became obvious. He calmly explained that the newer survey had established its control from a more recent subdivision reference point rather than the original county monument. Because the starting reference had been incorrect, every subsequent measurement shifted several feet away from the legally established property boundary despite appearing internally consistent. The hearing officer carefully reviewed every exhibit before asking the association survey consultant one simple question. Had the original county monument been incorporated into the newer survey? After a long silence, the consultant quietly acknowledged that it had not. The hearing room became completely still. Several minutes later, after reviewing the remaining evidence, the hearing officer read the written decision into the official record. The enforcement action was dismissed in its entirety. Every assessed fine was permanently withdrawn. The disputed boundary presented by the Homeowners Association was rejected because the overwhelming weight of licensed survey evidence, historical county records, original deeds, and the original survey monument established the lawful property line beyond reasonable dispute. The officer further recommended that the association commission a corrected survey before pursuing any future enforcement involving neighboring properties. Rebecca slowly lowered her eyes toward the documents resting before her. Nobody celebrated. Nobody applauded. The truth had simply taken its rightful place where assumptions had quietly stood only moments before, and as I looked across the hearing room, I realized that patient evidence had accomplished what anger never. When I returned to the ranch that evening, the first thing I noticed was the silence. The bulldozer was gone. The bright orange survey stakes that had divided my pasture for weeks had disappeared, leaving only the familiar stretch of green grass leading toward the eastern fence line. A warm breeze carried the scent of fresh hay through the open barn doors while the fading Texas sun painted long golden shadows across the weathered boards my grandfather had raised with his own hands. I walked slowly toward the old barn, resting one hand against the rough wood exactly where my father used to pause before beginning another day's work. Nothing about the building had changed, yet somehow everything felt different. It was no longer simply a place where my family stored equipment, repaired fences, or sheltered livestock during storms. It had become proof that patience could preserve what anger never could. Over the following weeks, the county updated its records to reflect the hearing officer's decision, and the Homeowners Association quietly withdrew every enforcement notice connected to my property. The certified letters stopped arriving. The payment demands disappeared. The $48,000 assessment became nothing more than another closed file stored inside a courthouse archive. Daniel Brooks returned one final time to install a permanent protective marker beside the original county survey monument, so it could never again disappear beneath decades of grass and soil. Standing beside that small weathered piece of iron, he smiled and told me that survey monuments rarely attracted attention until someone forgot why they mattered. I understood exactly what he meant. My attorney later explained that the hearing had already become an important example within the county because it reminded property owners, surveyors, and associations that historical evidence must never be ignored simply because newer documents appear more polished. Rebecca Collins never visited the ranch again, but several months later, I received a brief letter from the Homeowners Association acknowledging that the disputed boundary had been corrected according to the licensed survey accepted by the county. The letter contained no dramatic apology, only a professional acknowledgement that the matter had been resolved. Strangely, that was enough. I had never wanted revenge. I wanted the truth to be recognized, and now it had been. Life slowly returned to its familiar rhythm. Every morning, I opened the heavy iron barn latch before sunrise. I fed the cattle, repaired fences after summer storms, stacked fresh hay beneath the same wooden beams that had sheltered 3 generations of my family, and watched golden lights spread across the pasture exactly as it always had. Sometimes I would stop beside the protected survey monument before beginning my work, brushing away loose grass with my boot, just to remind myself that the smallest details often carry the greatest weight. People can argue over maps. Organizations can approve policies. New surveys can be commissioned, and official letters can fill entire filing cabinets. But the land remembers the first honest measurement made upon it. My father understood that long before I ever did. My grandfather trusted it without needing anyone to explain why. Now, every time I look across the eastern boundary toward the neighboring subdivision, I no longer think about the dispute that nearly changed everything. I think about a quiet lesson passed from one generation to the next. Facts do not become stronger because they are spoken loudly. They become stronger because they remain true, year after year, long after opinions, assumptions, and paperwork have faded away. The boundary never moved. We simply found our way back to where the truth had been waiting all along.